The stagecoach wheels dragged slowly across the dry earth as they entered Hollow Creek, carrying with them more than just dust. Inside, Eliza Hart sat still, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, feeling every small movement like it echoed through her chest. At just 19, she had already learned what it meant to lose control over her own future. Outside, the town revealed itself piece by piece, wooden buildings, faded signs, and people who stopped whatever they were doing just to watch her arrive. They didn't know her story, but they didn't need to. In towns like this, people always assumed, and most of the time they assumed right. When the coach came to a stop, silence followed. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind filled with judgment. Eliza stepped down carefully, her boots pressing into unfamiliar ground. Her grip tightened on the small suitcase she carried, as if it was the only thing connecting her to who she used to be. The sunlight was harsh, unforgiving, and it exposed everything. Her tired expression, her worn clothes, and the quiet fear she tried so hard to hide. Around her, eyes followed, not welcoming, not kind, just watching. Then she saw him, Caleb Rourke, standing apart from the others, like he didn't belong to the town, or maybe the town didn't belong to him. His hat was pulled low, his posture steady, his presence heavy. There was strength in him, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet, contained, almost guarded. There was no smile, no greeting, just a single nod. And somehow, that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't going to be easy for her. The wedding happened quickly, inside a cramped office that smelled of dust and old paper. No music, no guests, no joy, just words spoken out of necessity. Caleb's voice was steady when he said his vows. Not emotional, not cold, just certain. Eliza repeated hers just as calmly, even though inside, uncertainty was rising like a storm. She hadn't come here for love. She hadn't come here for happiness. She had come here because there were no other choices left. When it was done, there was no celebration, no moment of pause. Caleb simply picked up her suitcase and walked out. Eliza followed, her steps quiet but firm. Behind her, the town returned to its routine, as if nothing had happened. But something had. She had crossed into a life she didn't understand yet, and there was no going back. The ride away from Hollow Creek stretched long and silent. The land around them felt endless, dry, empty, and distant from everything she had known before. Eliza tried to speak once, then again, but Caleb's answers were short, almost automatic. Not rude, not kind, just distant. So she stopped trying. Instead, she watched him, the way he held the reins, the way his eyes scanned the horizon. He wasn't careless. He was always aware, like a man who had learned to expect trouble even in silence. When they reached the ridge, the land beyond slowly revealed itself. A small cabin stood against the open sky, surrounded by land that looked untouched but not abandoned. Eliza noticed the details immediately. Stacked lumber, tools arranged carefully, structures that seemed unfinished. It didn't look like a place forgotten. It looked like something waiting to be completed. Inside the cabin, everything felt simple, clean, practical, but empty of warmth. Caleb set her suitcase down near the door and stepped back, as if unsure how close he was supposed to stand. Then he spoke quietly, almost like it was an afterthought. "You can take the room. I'll stay in the barn." Eliza stared at him, confused. This wasn't what she expected, not even close. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for something she feared, something she thought was inevitable. But instead, she heard him outside. The sound of a blanket being laid down, the quiet distance he chose to keep. And slowly, something inside her shifted. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. Morning arrived with a different kind of silence. Caleb was already gone, leaving behind only small signs of care. Water warmed by the stove, firewood stacked neatly. Things done without needing to be said. And as Eliza stood there alone in that quiet space, she realized something she hadn't expected. This man wasn't what the town had warned her about. Not even close. The days that followed didn't bring answers, only routine. Caleb left before sunrise and returned off the dock, always carrying something. With tools, sacks heavier than anything two people could need. Eliza watched quietly at first, trying to understand the rhythm of this place. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't careless. Everything had order, intention. Even in silence, Caleb moved like a man with purpose. But that purpose remained hidden. And the more she noticed, the more she realized this wasn't just a simple life in isolation. There was something else beneath it, something he wasn't saying. At first, Eliza tried to ignore it. The distance, the silence, the strange feeling that she was living beside a man she didn't truly know. But it became harder with each passing day. He never treated her poorly, never raised his voice, never demanded anything from her. And somehow, that made it more confusing, because kindness without explanation can feel just as unsettling as cruelty. It leaves questions unanswered. It leaves space for doubt. And Eliza had lived long enough to know unanswered things rarely stay quiet forever. Then came the first night she heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind, steady, rhythmic, deliberate. A hammer. She stepped onto the porch, listening carefully as it echoed through the darkness beyond the ridge. It wasn't random. It wasn't occasional. It was controlled, repeated, intentional. Someone was working out there, and she didn't need to ask who. The next morning, she mentioned it. Caleb didn't even look up. Fixing things, he said, and that was all. But Eliza knew that wasn't the whole truth. The more she observed him, the more the pieces refused to fit together. Why did he bring more supplies than they needed? Why did he spend hours away from the land he already had? Why did he work at night, where no one could see? This wasn't the life of a man who had nothing. This was the life of someone building something. Something hidden. Something important. And for the first time since arriving, Eliza began to feel something stronger than fear. Curiosity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eliza stood outside again, listening. The hammer echoed faintly through the air. She followed the direction with her eyes, tracing the shape of the ridge. It would have been easy to walk there, to see for herself, to end the questions. But something stopped her. Not fear of him, but the feeling that crossing that line would change everything. Because some truths, once seen, cannot be unseen. Later that night, Caleb returned, his clothes dusted with sawdust, his hands worn from fresh work. He stopped when he saw her standing there. Their eyes met in silence, and for just a moment, something shifted. Not anger, not suspicion, something quieter, almost like concern. Not for himself, but for what she might discover. And that was the moment Eliza realized something important. Whatever he was hiding, it wasn't selfish. It wasn't dangerous. It was protected. The next morning, the feeling didn't leave her. If anything, it grew stronger. The questions became heavier, harder to ignore, because now she knew this wasn't about fear anymore. It was about truth. And the truth had been waiting just beyond that ridge the entire time. So when Caleb rode out again, just like every other day, she made a decision, not out of rebellion, not out of distrust, but because she needed to understand the life she had stepped into. She waited just long enough to be sure he wouldn't turn back. Then she stepped out into the open land, her heart beating faster with every step. The climb toward the ridge wasn't easy. The ground was uneven, the wind pushing against her like it didn't want her to continue. But she kept going, because sometimes the only way forward is through the unknown. And when she reached the top, she stopped. What she saw on the other side wasn't what she expected, not even close. There were buildings, more than one, structured, planned, not random repairs, not scattered work. This was something intentional. Cabins stood in rows, some finished, some still in progress. Supplies were stacked neatly, tools placed with care. This wasn't the work of a man hiding. This was the work of a man building something bigger than himself. Eliza stepped forward slowly, her breath catching as realization began to form. She opened the door to the nearest cabin, and everything changed. Inside were beds, small ones, more than one, carefully made. In another building, food, enough for many people. In another, a table, and a board with faint chalk marks. This wasn't storage. This wasn't personal work. This was preparation. 4 lives, 4 children. And in that moment, every story she had been told about Caleb Rourke shattered completely. Eliza stood there in silence, her fingers still resting on the edge of one of the small beds, as the truth settled slowly into her chest. This wasn't something temporary. This wasn't an accident or a passing effort. Every board, every nail, every blanket folded with care spoke of intention, of planning, of purpose. The man she had married, the one the town pitted and dismissed, had been building something quietly, patiently, and completely alone. And as the wind moved softly through the unfinished cabins, she realized just how wrong everyone had been about him. The sound of hooves broke the stillness. Sharp, fast, coming closer. Eliza turned instinctively, her heart jumping as Caleb rode toward her, his expression tighter than she had ever seen it before. There was no anger in it, but there was something guarded, something protective. He pulled the horse to a stop and stepped down without a word, his eyes scanning the open door behind her, then returning to her face. The silence between them felt heavier than ever before, not because it was empty, but because it was filled with everything left unsaid. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his voice low but firm. Eliza didn't step back. She didn't look away. For the first time since she had met him, she held her ground without hesitation. "Then tell me what this is," she replied. Her voice didn't tremble, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had already crossed a line that mattered. Caleb stood there, unmoving, as if weighing something far deeper than her question. And for a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, it wasn't in a rush. It wasn't defensive. It came slowly, like something he hadn't allowed himself to say out loud in a very long time. He told her about the settlement. The one he had found years ago after fire and loss had stripped it down to nothing. He told her about the children left behind, hungry, scared, and with no one to claim them. At first, he hadn't planned to stay. He hadn't planned to take responsibility. But sometimes the moment you step in to help, you don't step out again. One night, he said quietly, turned into two, then a week, then longer. His eyes drifted briefly toward the cabins, as if he were seeing them as they once were, empty land, bare ground, nothing built yet. They kept coming, he added. Children with no names anyone remembered, no homes anyone wanted, no place anyone offered them. And each time, he had done the only thing he knew how to do. He stayed. He worked. He built, not for himself, but for them. Eliza listened without interrupting, the weight of his words settling deeper with every sentence. Suddenly, everything made sense. The supplies, the long hours, the silence, the distance. It wasn't secrecy born from guilt. It was protection born from purpose. "Why hide it?" she asked softly. Caleb exhaled slowly, as if the answer had always been simple. "Because the town doesn't see this the way you do," he said. "They see it as trouble, as something to avoid, not something to build." She looked around again, but this time differently, not as an outsider, not as someone discovering a secret, but as someone beginning to understand it. This wasn't just work. This was sacrifice. Quiet, steady, relentless sacrifice. And for the first time, she saw Caleb not as a man the town described, but as the man he truly was. Not distant, not strange, just carrying something far too heavy, alone. There was only one question left. It had been waiting since the day she arrived. "Why me?" she asked. Caleb didn't hesitate this time. His answer came quickly, simply, honestly, "Because I can't do it alone anymore." There was no softness in the words, no attempt to make them sound better than they were. Just truth, raw and unpolished. And somehow, that truth felt more powerful than anything else he had said. Eliza stood there, surrounded by unfinished cabins and quiet proof of something far greater than she had imagined. This wasn't the life she thought she had agreed to. It wasn't just survival. It wasn't just escape. It was something bigger. Something that required more from her than she had planned to give. But as she looked at the small beds, the careful work, the effort placed into every detail, she realized something else. This wasn't a burden. It was a chance. Before she could answer, the sound of wheels reached them. A wagon approached slowly, carrying 3 children, thin, tired, holding everything they owned in small bundles. Caleb stepped back slightly, his posture still strong, but something in him shifted. Uncertainty, not in his work, but in this moment. And that was when Eliza understood exactly where she belonged. Not behind him, not separate from him, but beside him. And as she stepped forward to greet the children, something changed, not just in her life, but in theirs as well. Eliza didn't hesitate. As the wagon came to a stop and the children climbed down slowly, she stepped forward and lowered herself to their level. Their eyes were cautious, guarded in a way no child should ever be. She spoke gently, asking their names, her voice softer than it had ever been since arriving in Hollow Creek. And in that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, permanently, because the work Caleb had been carrying alone was no longer his to bear alone. That first day wasn't easy. The children were tired, uncertain, unsure if this place would truly be different. Eliza moved carefully, offering water, preparing food, guiding them into the small cabins Caleb had built. She didn't force smiles. She didn't promise things she couldn't guarantee. Instead, she gave them something far more important, patience. And Caleb watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, but his silence now carried something new, trust. The days began to change after that, slowly but steadily. More children arrived, each one carrying their own story, their own fear, their own silence. And with each arrival, the place Caleb had built began to come alive. What had once been quiet structures of wood and effort became filled with voices, footsteps, movement, life. And Eliza found herself at the center of it, not as someone forced into this life, but as someone choosing it. She taught them small things at first, how to read simple words, how to write their names, how to sit at a table without fear. The rough wooden board became a classroom. The long table became a place of learning. And every small success, every smile, every moment of comfort added something the buildings alone could never provide, warmth. And Caleb saw it, even if he never said it. Caleb continued building. Stronger walls, more cabins, a proper well. He worked the same way he always had. Quiet, steady, relentless. But now there was a difference. He wasn't building in silence anymore. He was building in the sound of laughter, in the echo of voices that filled the space around him. And though he never spoke of it, something in his presence softened. The distance he once kept began to fade. The town eventually found out. News traveled, as it always does. At first, the whispers returned. Questions, doubts, disbelief. But this time, something was different. People came to see it for themselves. And what they saw wasn't trouble. It wasn't burden. It was proof. Proof that something meaningful had been built where no one expected it. And slowly, the same people who once pitted Caleb began to understand him. Seasons passed. The land changed. And so did Eliza. The girl who arrived with fear in her eyes and uncertainty in her heart was no longer there. In her place stood someone stronger, someone grounded, someone who had found purpose not in escape, but in staying. And every time she looked around at the children, at the cabins, at the life growing around her, she knew she had made the right choice. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the children ran freely between the cabins, their laughter carried across the open land. Eliza stood on the porch and watched. The same land that once felt empty now felt full of life, full of meaning. And beside her stood Caleb, silent as always, but no longer distant. Not from her. Not anymore. She reached for his hand without hesitation. This time, there was no uncertainty in the gesture. No fear. Only truth. "You were never the man nobody wanted," she said quietly. Caleb didn't look away. He didn't retreat into silence. He stood there, holding her hand, and for the first time, he allowed himself to accept something he had never believed before, that he had always been more than what the world had seen. Together, they looked out at what had once been nothing more than empty land beyond a ridge. Now it was a home, a place built with effort, with sacrifice, with quiet determination, a place filled with children who had once been forgotten, now given something real. And in that final moment, as the light faded and the land settled into calm, one truth remained stronger than anything else. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the very ones capable of changing it forever. He was never unwanted. He was just building something the world wasn't ready to see.